Tēnā koutou katoa. As Rob said, I'm Karen Lavin. I'm the General Manager of Evidence and Advice here at the Commission. And great to see so many people joining this webinar today. It's been a long time coming doing this work on the National Climate Change Risk Assessment. So can I please just move to the next slide, please? So just starting out with a bit of context as to why this work is important. So this past summer, we've seen just how devastating climate-related hazards can be on people's lives across the Motu. People are facing increasing disruption from storms, heavy rain, landslides, drought, and sea level rise. Going back 15 years ago, damaging storms happened about once a month. This past summer, what we've seen is that happening about once a week. What that really shows us is that climate change is not a future issue. It's reshaping the hazards we're seeing today. It's increasing their frequency, increasing their severity, and overall resulting in a more unpredictable climate. This is not business as usual. Climate change is shifting what we think of as normal, and our systems need to adapt in response to that. And this is really where the National Climate Change Risk Assessment comes in. So this assessment helps us focus on where risk is highest, where impacts are greatest, and therefore, as a result, where we need to prioritise coordinated action that will make the biggest difference. By acting now, government, businesses, and communities can strengthen resilience and better protect the things that we rely on and that we value. Next slide, please. The purpose of the climate change risk assessment is twofold. Firstly, it's to assess both the current and future risks that climate change poses to our economy, society, environment, and ecology. And secondly, it's about identifying the most significant risks based on their nature, severity, and the need for coordinated action. Now that we've delivered this big piece of work, the government has 2 years to respond in the next National Adaptation Plan, and that's required in law for them to do that. In total, in the risk assessment, we have looked at 37 separate risks. 30 of those were assessed by the Commission with experts supporting us on that, external experts, and 7 were assessed by independent researchers in a distinct Ao Māori domain. As you can see in the figure here on the left, so that describes climate risks. Climate risks are defined by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, and that's the risk definition that we've used in this work. The definition of climate risk is the potential for adverse consequences to human and ecological systems. And very importantly, a risk is made up of 3 components. Firstly, hazard, which is a physical effect or trend caused by climate change. Secondly is exposure, so who or what is exposed to that hazard. And the third is vulnerability, and that's factors that determine the nature and extent of that impact. Next slide, please. The assessment that we've completed and that we're talking to today is broad and national in scope, and it provides a comprehensive scan of climate risks at that national level. In the assessment, we've drawn on a broad range of evidence, both qualitative and quantitative. It also relies on expert judgment by the Commission and by experts from both New Zealand and overseas. And the risk assessment describes the nature of the risks, their severity, and what is underway to address them. The assessment has 2 main reports. The first is the Priorities for Action report, which focuses on the 10 most significant risks that the government should address in the next National Adaptation Plan. And the full assessment is a much longer report that presents the analysis and scoring for all 37 of the risks. So there's about a 5 to 10 page summary for each risk. Both of those reports summarise the most recent evidence around projected climate change and associated hazards, and that provides really important context for the risks that we've looked at. I will now pass over to Holly, who will take you through the risk assessment in more detail.
Kia ora. Thank you, Karen. Ngā mihi nui kia koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. No ingarangi me kotirana o ki tipuna I te puawi raru I te raukura o te Aotearoa I te awa kairangi ko Holly Walker tōku ingoa nō reira tēnā koutou katoa. My name's Holly Walker, and as Karen and Rob have mentioned, I was the project director for this national risk assessment. And I'm going to take you through now a little bit more detail about how we assess the risks and what we have found in the assessment. As Karen mentioned before, there are 37 individual climate risks analysed in the assessment, and to assess them, we looked at each risk and scored it 3 different ways. First way we scored the risks was to look at their severity. So this is a measure of the seriousness of the potential consequences that these risks pose to the country on a scale that ranges from minor to extreme. And for the severity part of the assessment, we looked at this at different time scales. So we looked at how severe the risk is currently presenting now in 2026, how severe it is likely to be by mid-century 2050, and how severe it is likely to be by 2090. But for that furthest timescale, looking out to near the end of the century, we do that under 2 different climate impact scenarios. The first being assuming we've had a global warming level of around 2 degrees. That's our low climate impact scenario, excuse me. And the second being assuming that there's been global warming of between 3 and 3.5 degrees by 2090. And that's our high impact scenario, just reflecting the fact that we don't know exactly how climate change will play out in that time frame. The second way we assess each risk is looking at what we've called its policy readiness. So this is a measure of the extent to which current policies, plans and actions are in place that effectively address the risk. So there are different components of this score. We look at the coverage of any policies and actions that are in place, whether they adequately cover the risk. We look at the readiness to implement those actions and whether they can realistically be delivered. And we look at something which we call, which is sometimes called residual risk, or the shortfall, which is if all of those current policies and actions were effectively implemented, how much of the risk would remain? Then we combine all of those into an overall readiness score, which ranges from no significant gaps in readiness to address the risk through to what we've called insufficient readiness. And then the final way we've assessed each risk is to look at its cascading and indirect relationships with other risks. This is a new element of our 2026 assessment, and it's really a recognition that, in reality, while we can identify a number of individual risks, 37 in this case, that the country is facing from climate change, what happens in the real world is that they don't play out as individual risks by themselves. They often trigger each other in a chain of cause and effect. And so to assess this as part of our prioritisation of risk, we asked a question. We looked at which risks are likely to trigger each other, and then we assessed that by flipping that around and asking ourselves, okay, well, if we know that risks play out in a chain of cause and effect, which ones have the most potential to reduce each other? So if we reduce this risk, how many other risks might it help to reduce, and how strong is that relationship? So that was our cascading risk score. One thing I will note is that the 7 risks in the Ao Māori domain were not assessed for their cascading risk in the same way. And that's partly because the analysis for those risks was undertaken independently by kaupapa Māori researchers, and also because in a Māori worldview, that interdependence and interconnection is largely taken into account already in that Ao Māori way of seeing the world. And so finally, after we had assessed the risks in these 3 ways, we had to come up with a list of the most significant ones that we present to the government for response in the next National Adaptation Plan. And so the way we considered which risks were the most significant is after scoring them for in those 3 other ways, we did some screening based on Which risks do we know are already now in 2026 presenting as major, and where there are also at least major gaps in our readiness to respond? Those are going to be significant risks because they're already here and there are gaps, major gaps in how prepared we are. Then we looked ahead and we thought about risks that we've assessed as being likely to be major by 2050, where there is really that insufficient readiness. That means we need time to prepare for these risks. They're going to affect people soon, and there is a very low level of current readiness, and we need that preparation time. And finally, we looked at risks again that are likely to be major by 2050, but where we assess them as having a high or a very high potential to help address other risks with that cascading score. And then we scanned across all of those to see, after we'd done that, whether there were any missing that seemed like they were very significant and not caught by any of those three steps. And that was how we came up with the 10 most significant risks that we've highlighted in the assessment. Next slide, please. So for those who are going to read the reports, this slide shows a couple of examples of risk scorecards from the full assessment report. On the left, that's a single risk. In this case, I think it's the risk to ports and airports. And it shows the scores that I've just described and the rationale for each. That red-orange palette is the severity score from minor to extreme across time. And the blue palette shows the policy readiness scores from no significant gaps through to insufficient. The shortfall column is a measure of residual risk, and the scale for that is the same as for severity. So on the left, an individual risk, on the right, a whole domain of risk, and the colours matching across. The green column shows that cascading potential of each risk to address others from low to very high. So for those reading the full assessment report, these scorecards may be a helpful way of getting a snapshot either of an individual risk or of a domain of risk. Next slide, please. So these, after going through that exercise, scoring the risks in the way that I've described, these are the 10 most significant risk areas that we have identified in the assessment. These are the risk areas where our assessment indicates focused action would make the biggest difference. They're the risk areas that are already likely to be seriously affecting people, and in many cases that are already seriously affecting people, or the risk areas where we know those impacts are coming soon and it will take time to adequately prepare. And they're also risk areas where we know that acting soon can have the biggest influence on reducing many other risks. They're grouped into 4 categories: key infrastructure, communities and safety, nature and the bioeconomy, and decisions and funding. And I'll go through each of those categories and the risks in them in a little bit more detail in a moment. Before I do, though, at this high level, I think what's notable is that many of these significant risks relate to the systems that support people's quality of life and their economic resilience. Things like roads and railways, drinking water, natural resources, very fundamental to our daily life here in Aotearoa New Zealand. And adapting effectively to these risks is going to really therefore depend on strengthening those underpinning structures and tools, the things that keep the country running, things like funding and financing, trust in democratic institutions, and our social connections and well-being. We think that at the end of this process, this list of 10 risk areas that you're seeing on the screen here is a robust and well-balanced list. There's a strong correlation between the risks that were found to be significant in the first National Climate Change Risk Assessment in 2020, but not a total correlation. There are some differences as well. And overall, it's comparable with recent international risk assessments, but also reflects some of the unique characteristics that we have here in Aotearoa New Zealand. Next slide, please. So I'm now just going to run through each of those significant risks and say a little bit about each of them and why they are there. Obviously, each one of these is a huge area that we could give a whole presentation on. So I'm going to run through them very quickly, but we'll hopefully have time for questions about any of these or anything else that you might be interested in at the end of the session. So in that key infrastructure category, the first one is risks to water infrastructure, and that's all types of water infrastructure: drinking water, wastewater, and stormwater. What we're seeing is that climate change is putting increasing pressure on every part of that water system, and it's already under intense strain. There are, of course, reforms underway in this area, and they present a real opportunity to embed climate resilience in for the future. But without that resilience, this is the first risk area that we think might reach that extreme severity level, and that may be reached within the next 25 years. So quite an urgent response required for water infrastructure. The next is the risk to buildings. Buildings across Aotearoa New Zealand are exposed to a wide range of climate-related hazards that range from heat to flooding. And these hazards can threaten both the structure, the actual integrity of those buildings, and whether we can use them in the way that they need to be used. And when we talk about buildings, we're talking, of course, about people's homes, people's workplaces, schools, all of the places of significance to people's daily lives. There are increasing insurance issues and challenges with displacement that are related to the risk to buildings, but that are also risks in their own right that are analysed separately in the assessment as well. So those are the infrastructure risks. Then we look at risks. Sorry, no, they're not. We've still got road and rail networks. So the third infrastructure risk is that risk to road and rail networks. And here we see climate change is putting increasing pressure on the country's transport infrastructure, causing both short-term and lasting damage. And what's so critical about our transport networks is they keep communities and the economy connected, and they keep goods moving. They are how all of us and everything we use and need move around the country. So when our transport infrastructure is impacted, it affects communities, it affects the wider economy, it prevents access for emergency services, and many other things are impacted: power, telecommunications, critical connective infrastructure. So now, second category, risks to communities and safety. The first is a combined risk to social and community well-being. So what we're seeing here is that there are increasing impacts on people's well-being because of climate change. And that is particularly in our assessment manifested in risks to people's mental health and well-being, and in risks to social cohesion. What we're seeing is that the human and financial costs of climate change are very high, and there is not a lot in place to prevent climate-related distress and uncertainty from having an impact on people's individual and collective well-being and on the cohesion of our communities as a whole. The second is risks to the emergency management system, where we see really that the country's emergency management system is under pressure, and it may struggle to respond to the increasing frequency, severity, and extent of disasters that can result from climate change and climate hazards. And we have, I think, many recent examples of this that people will be all too aware of from the kinds of events that Karen started out by speaking about in recent months. And finally, in this category, ngā mea hira hira o te ao Māori. This is risks in the Māori world. Ngā mea hira hira o te ao Māori translates as things of importance in the Māori world. Here we're seeing that climate change is going to impact Māori in distinct ways, from cultural practices to their health and well-being to legal rights. And there are some long-standing factors, such as land marginalisation and alienation, that make these impacts worse and can reduce options for adapting to the changing climate for Māori. Next slide, please. So the next category is risks to nature and the bioeconomy. And here the first risk is a general risk to ecosystems and biodiversity, ecosystems of all kinds. We're seeing that climate change is placing increasing pressure on our rivers, our forests, our coasts, and our ocean ecosystems, and the native plants and animals and taonga species that are part of those systems and that keep them healthy. And it's really fundamental. So when these natural systems are under pressure, the effects are felt across our whole country, across our communities, across our economy, in things like air quality, water quality, soil quality, human health, recreational opportunities, and jobs that depend on nature. And speaking of jobs that depend on nature, the second risk in this category is to a specific sector that of the bioeconomy that does very much depend on nature, and that's to the forestry sector. Here we're seeing that climate-related impacts from extreme weather, drought, and wildfire through to new pests and diseases are affecting managed and production forests. And because forestry is so central to our country's response to climate change and to our efforts to reduce emissions, to climate change mitigation, to reaching that net zero 2050 target, it's really, there's some fundamental hand-in-hand nature of climate change mitigation and adaptation that needs to be thought about in relation to this sector in particular. Finally, in that category, what we've called ones to watch. So although we have not identified these two risks as significant in this assessment, we are highlighting the risks to pastoral agriculture and horticulture as ones to watch for the future. These risks were rated at minor severity at present, but our assessment suggests that they may jump directly to major severity by 2050, not passing through moderate on the way. So a steep change is likely. And currently, both of these very critical sectors of the economy are coping reasonably well with climate-related pressures at the national level. We know there are lots and lots of sometimes devastating impacts on specific farms and specific locations. But at the national level, that ability to adapt has been quite effective to date. But as climate change affects the productivity and profitability of these sectors, it's looking like the impacts are going to accelerate and reach into other areas of the economy. So we are highlighting those as ones that also require early attention and preparation. The final category is risks to decisions and funding. So the first significant risk here is a risk to central and local government funding. As climate change impacts intensify, both central and local government face higher costs for disaster response, for infrastructure repair, for welfare and health services, and for long-term adaptation. And when there's a lack of clarity or direction on cost sharing or a lack of investment, the result can be councils and communities having fewer options to adapt to climate change and costs being pushed on to future generations. So the risk here is not only to how we fund adaptation, but also that having to continually respond to climate change impacts and to climate change events puts at risk the funding for other core services that are required for everybody in the country. And finally, the last significant risk is a risk to decision-making and delivery. So as climate change hazards intensify, and we are beginning to see this, I think, there is a risk that the country is caught up in successive urgent responses that make that long-term decision-making and adaptation delivery much more complex and difficult to achieve. Next slide, please. So, as I've just described, this is a future-looking exercise. We are thinking about what might happen by 2050, what might happen by 2090. And what we're seeing is that scientific understanding is growing about many of the climate hazards that the country faces. But because we're talking here about an unknown future, there's always some uncertainty involved in climate risk assessment. What we know is what types of impacts are likely to happen, but we don't know exactly when they will occur, exactly where they will occur, or exactly what that impact will be. And that kind of uncertainty is inherent in any risk assessment, and it's really part of what motivates a risk assessment like this. It's an exploration of potential negative consequences in order that they can be minimized. It's not a prediction. It is an exercise in preparation. So we know enough about the challenges that Aotearoa New Zealand is going to face over the coming decades to be able to put the country in a good position to prepare for those impacts. And this national risk assessment, this national climate change risk assessment, is a key tool to help successive governments to be able to do that. There are, of course, also always unknowns, and there are always gaps in that evidence base, but that doesn't need to prevent action or obscure the urgency of acting. We obviously will continue to strengthen and support the strengthening of that evidence base to even further enhance the accuracy and usefulness of future risk assessments. But enough is known now to be able to act on what we know already. Next slide, please. So, along with the two main reports that Karen highlighted earlier in the presentation, it's a large volume of additional material that has been published alongside the risk assessment. So there is a detailed report covering the methodology that we used to undertake the assessment. Some of the slides that I presented earlier about the scorecards, but in much, much more detail. So if you're interested in that, that summary of method report would be a good place to look. And as we mentioned as well, the 7 individual risks to Māori that are assessed in that ngā mea here Aotearoa Māori domain of risk there is a separate standalone independent kaupapa Māori assessment of those risks that is available as well as part of the broader suite of the assessment. There is also a large volume of other supplementary material, including evidence commissioned. I won't list it all because it will take too long, but if you're interested in any of that material, I do recommend having a look on our website. There is a treasure trove of it there available. Next slide, please. So I guess in conclusion, what are some of the key takeaways that we think are important for people to be aware of? Well, this National Climate Change Risk Assessment, it's really setting out the priorities for decision makers as well as businesses and communities to be able to act to prepare for the impacts that are coming. It shows us where planning and investment can make the biggest difference by addressing the most pressing risks facing the country. It's a serious and sober piece of work. Aotearoa New Zealand faces serious risks that impact daily life, that are putting pressure on our water systems, our homes, our roads, our emergency services, our ecosystems, and even the way that decisions are made. It's a serious piece of work, and it means that we need to act sooner rather than later to address those key risks. The good thing is doing that will minimise that multi-billion-dollar cost that we would see from delaying climate resilience measures. And of course, none of this takes place in isolation. It's part of the whole climate change picture. Reducing global emissions, meeting those net zero 2050 targets is also essential to slow climate change and make those future impacts of climate change easier to manage for Aotearoa New Zealand and around the world. So that is the conclusion of the presentation part. I'm going to hand back to you, Rob, now to steer us through the Q&A.
Kia ora, Holly. Thank you, and also thanks to Karen. So Q&A. So with the time remaining, let's just a couple of prompts as reminders, please. Please submit your questions into the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. It would be really helpful if you could state your name and organization and or sector. Also, lastly, just the upvote function, which is just a thumbs up emoji, which will, if you have a question that is similar or that particular question is of interest to you. So that will promote the question to the top of the thread and will give it better chance of the team answering it. So I'll fire out the questions, and we've got the first question here from Irene Clark. The first one, could you please describe a bit more of how the cascading risk was assessed and what was the method or tool used to assess the integration? I will pass that question on to Holly.
Yeah, kia ora, Rob, and kia ora, Irene. Great question. Yes, so as I said, cascading risk was an area of real focus for us in this assessment. I think building from what was done last time, where it was acknowledged that risks cascade and many of the relationships between risks were identified. What we were hoping to do this time was to bring that to bear in the scoring and prioritization of risks as well. The method that we used to do that involved essentially taking each individual risk from the assessment and pairing it with every other risk. So setting those two risks alongside each other in turn and asking the question, if we reduce this first risk, so for example, if we reduced the risk to road and rail networks, which other risks would also be reduced at the same time? And doing that one at a time in pairs. So we looked at the two risks alongside each other. We gave them a score in terms of the strength of that relationship. So, for example, if we gave it a 3, it was a 0 to 3 scale. If we said, okay, the risk between road and rail networks is at the relationship between road and rail networks and electricity and telecommunications infrastructure is very strong. That would mean fully mitigating the risks to road and rail networks would have a major impact on the risk to electricity and telecommunications infrastructure. We did that for each possible pair of risks and then essentially made a ranked table. And then gave them a score between low potential if they were in the bottom half of that table, up to very high potential if they were in the top 10% of that table. There is a lot more detail about that in our summary of method report. So if that cascading risk methodology is something that you are interested in, definitely recommend having a read of that summary of method report.
Bye, Holly. Thank you for that. We've got another question here from Derek Finn. Apologies if I've captured that incorrectly, but Derek's question is, what will central government do with this information? So what I'll do is I'll pass that question over to you, Karen, if you wouldn't mind.
Sure. Thanks for the question, Derek. So the Commission's role is to provide this risk assessment to the Minister of Climate Change. And the next step in the process there is that the Minister of Climate Change is responsible for developing a national adaptation plan. And he has 2 years to do that. That's required in legislation, and it does consider the information that's come through from the risk assessment. The other piece of work that's also outlined in legislation is that the Commission then monitors progress of that national adaptation plan. And at the moment, we do that every 2 years. Our second version of that monitoring will be coming out in August this year. But when it does come back to it, the Commission's role is to highlight the evidence. So in this case, we're highlighting the risks so the government and communities can take that information and can plan more effectively using it.
Kia ora, Karen. Thank you. Moving along, another question here from Catherine Wallace. So Catherine's on here. In the nature and biodiversity risks section, you refer to ecosystems and biodiversity. My sense is that we should also consider biogeophysical and biogeochemical systems disruptions as well. This would acknowledge the systems that underlie ecosystems and human activities are altered with huge potential to disrupt other systems. This is Earth systems disruptions. Is there any comment there? I might just pass it on to Holly. Any comment to that?
Yeah, kia ora. Thanks, Kath. It's a great question. And you're correct. So those biogeophysical and biogeochemical systems very much are an important part of that consideration for how climate change affects the environment. And yes, we took a broad approach to the risks in the natural environment domain, so that ecological functioning, including those kinds of processes and their impacts, were part of what we considered for the risks in that domain. In the full assessment report, the longer of the two reports, there's quite a lot of detail about what was specifically considered in that natural environment domain, if you're interested.
Thanks, Holly. Good question. So moving along, I've got another question here, sorry, from Morgan Waugh. Morgan's question is, what advice would you give for enabling action on these risks whilst in an election year? If I may, I'll just pass that on to Karen.
Oh, thanks for the question, Morgan. One of the things just to note about the National Climate Change Risk Assessment is that we don't provide policy recommendations in this piece of work. Just before I talked a little bit about the adaptation monitoring work we do, with the next piece on that out in August this year, that piece of work will provide policy recommendations. And so that's really a key place to look for when it comes. Apologies, I can't get ahead on what's in that. But if you're interested, you can also go back, go onto our website and look at the monitoring report that we did in 2024, and you'll see the sorts of policy recommendations we provided then.
Thanks, Karen. Moving along, we have a question here from Dilys Fong. Apologies if I've pronounced it incorrectly. Are there any resources developed for or future intention to communicate findings to the general public and lay people? I will pass that question on to Holly, please.
Kia ora, Dilys. Yeah, good question. Obviously, events like today are a really important part of that dissemination of the information. We also held a Zooey yesterday in particular for iwi Māori stakeholders talking in more detail about the impacts of the report for iwi Māori. And there's also a wide range of, as I mentioned, alongside the risk reports themselves, a wide range of published information on our website, including shorter summary reports or summary documents that are not like reading one of these whole reports. So for that general public audience, there is what we call an at-a-glance summary. There's also an A3 snapshot of three A3 pages, kind of summarising the whole assessment. And in terms of events and ways to communicate with different audiences, we are very keen to do that. So if you have groups, organisations, networks that you think would like to hear more about the risk assessment, please use that email address that Rob mentioned earlier. We're very open to invitations to come and talk with people more about this work.
Kia ora, good to steer there. Next question, we've got a question from Te Taru White. Te is asking, I assume that this type of study is happening in other international domains. Is there collaboration happening to endorse or otherwise your findings, such recommendations? Sorry, I might pass that question on to Holly. Any comment on that?
Yeah. It's a really cool part of doing this work actually is that we're in a community of other jurisdictions who are also undertaking risk assessments of this nature. So and some countries are much deeper into this cycle than we are. So in the UK, I think they are, this is our second national risk assessment in Aotearoa New Zealand. I think they're up to the fourth or fifth in the UK. So we've been really able to benefit from that experience internationally, other countries and other jurisdictions like the EU undertaking their own risk assessments. Australia did theirs last year, which was really timely for us. And there's certainly a community of climate risk assessment practitioners which we're part of and are able to share that knowledge internationally. We also benefited from international review of our findings of this assessment in particular. So our methodology was reviewed by three independent international reviewers, one from the UK, one from Italy, and then our findings in particular were reviewed by an Australian expert. So we're really fortunate to be part of that international community of practice, and there's lots that we can learn. And hopefully now others can learn from us. I think that cascading risk methodology that we talked about a little bit earlier is quite new. And so it's also an offering, I guess, we can make internationally for others who are thinking about how to do that in their own work in the future.
Kia ora, Holly. Next question coming through thick and fast, but we've got a question here from Greg Stevens, local government sector. So this assessment focuses on physical risks from a changing or changed climate. Are there any plans to look at the transitional risks in moving to a low emissions economy as well? I might just pass that question across to Karen, if you wouldn't mind, please.
Cool. And thanks for that question, Greg. This is something that we thought a lot about at the very start of the risk assessment process, and we decided not to include transition risks in here. So this risk assessment is focused on physical risks and how those physical risks cascade across systems. A couple of things that I would mention, within the risk assessment, we do consider interactions between emissions reductions and adaptation as part of the assessment. But the other piece that I'd point to, and this is really the reason why we haven't included transition risks in this assessment, is that alongside the adaptation work that the Commission does, we also have an emissions reduction function as well. So every 5 years, the Commission provides advice on emissions budgets that provide stepping stones towards our emissions reduction target. And that really is looking in some ways at transition risks, particularly from that emissions reduction side.
Kia ora. Thanks, Karen. Thanks, Greg. I'm going to pass the next one over across to Holly. And that's a question from Lisa Armstrong. And the question is, do you have any engagement and workshops planned specifically with local government on the assessment? Question mark.
Yeah, thanks, Lisa. Obviously, this work is of real interest to the local government sector. It's got that national scope and it's got that requirement for the central government to respond, but it's obviously critical business for local government as well. So yes, we're really keen to engage with local government about this. We're working with LGNZ at the moment about an opportunity to talk through their networks about the report, and also in close touch with the Aotearoa Society of Adaptation Professionals, or ASAP, which some people might know as ACAN, was its previous name. That's a largely local government, although not exclusively local government, network of adaptation professionals, and we're working closely with them to set up opportunities to talk more widely with local government about this work.
Kia ora. Questions coming in thick and fast. So moving right along, I might just come back to you. This question is from Belinda McFadgen. Many thanks for this presentation. Thanks for publishing such a comprehensive piece of comprehensive report. The question is about the three areas used to assess significance: severity, readiness, and cascading risk. Are these areas all weighted equally to find the final score for each risk, or is one component weighted more than the others? I might just pass that question across to you, Holly, please.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Belinda. Great question. So I guess the thing I would clarify there is I guess there is not one final score for each individual risk. So the scorecards for the risks show all of those dimensions you've mentioned: severity, readiness, and cascading risk. That they're not weighted in any particular way. So as I mentioned, once they each had a score for those three dimensions, then we used three principles based on those scores to work out which ones would fall into that most significant category. There wasn't a weighting associated with that, but there was an attempt to make sure we were drawing on each of the three scoring methods to inform our decisions about which ones were the most significant. Again, recommend, if you're interested in that kind of thing, the summary of method report talks a lot in more detail.
Thanks, Tanya and Holly. Next question. It's a question from Tanya Roach. How might this work be utilised to forward plan a national energy strategy? E.g., is solar, wind, hydro, or geothermal more resilient to climate change? I might just throw that across to you, Karen, please.
Thanks. And absolutely, resilience is something that is really crucial to be considering in a forward energy strategy. I think what we're experiencing at the moment with the fuel crisis is really evident of just how important resilience is. There will be different impacts depending on what type of generation we're talking about. So, for example, with hydro, there may be some times of increased dry periods. When it comes to wind energy, there may be times where wind patterns are more variable. So that sort of information does need to be factored in to a forward plan and a forward energy strategy. It's really important to be thinking about the geographic spread of our energy assets as part of that, and have a mix of different types of generation. So a mix of solar, wind, geothermal, and hydro. I guess another piece of information I would add in is the role of distributed generation and the resilience that can provide using rooftop solar and batteries when, for example, electricity lines might go down, which is what we see with some of these weather events. I guess just bringing it back, it's when developing an energy strategy, it's important to consider this and then think really holistically about how we go about electrifying the economy to be able to balance those risks.
Thanks, Karen. Moving right along, just going straight to the next question. We've got a question from James Hughes. Kia ora, James. I'm interested in your reflections on what were the biggest methodological challenges which caused the largest debate and discussion within the team. I might pass it across to you, Holly, please.
Yeah, great question. Kia ora, James. I mean, it was a really interesting and challenging exercise for all of us and a super stimulating one, as you can well imagine. The way it worked with the scoring is we had so each of those 37 risks we talked about, or at least each of the 30 that we analysed in-house here in the Commission, had a primary author attached to it. So that person assembled the evidence base for that risk over many months. And then once that was done, we moved into the scoring phase, and we had the author who was responsible for the research for each risk essentially bring a proposal for how we should score that risk to a consensus-based workshop. Which we then tested internally very robustly with each other. Some were straightforward, some we felt it was very clear, the evidence base was very clear, the information was really clear on what the scoring should be, but there certainly were risks where we were not in agreement and we were sometimes not able to reach consensus in the first hui about what the scores should be. Some of the factors I think that fed into when we did have really good, healthy, robust debate on those scores would be things like distinguishing the difference between observed recent impacts and risk. So while they're very closely related, risk is the potential for adverse consequences that have not yet occurred, and impacts are like observing recent events and what has occurred to help us inform that decision about risk. It's kind of a fine distinction, but there is a distinction there, and it was an important one for us to keep in mind in our scoring, particularly when there had been recent lived experience of certain types of events, using that as evidence of risk, but not letting impact take over. So that was one challenge, I think. And I think, we have a diverse team here with different backgrounds, different training. Some of us are really quantitative thinkers. Some of us are more qualitative, and we had to draw on both of those skill sets and both of those types of evidence to make this assessment. What gave us confidence in our decision making was that we had expert review groups reviewing both our evidence and our scoring, of which James, of course, was one, and we were really grateful, James, for you and the other expert reviewers who tested our thinking for us and made sure it was really robust.
Thanks, Holly. Moving along. So we've got a question here from Veronica, Spittle. Veronica's question is, how would you recommend applying the findings at a district level? I'm going to pass that question across to you, please, Karen.
Kia ora. Thanks, Rob. So I think first and foremost, there is a huge amount of information in this risk assessment. In the full assessment report, there's 800 references. So first and foremost, this is a big source of information that anyone can draw on for their work. I just want to highlight that. Secondly, because this is a systematic look across a range of risks, there is a lot of information within that will be useful for you to consider from that perspective. I do want to emphasise this is a national level risk assessment. We have considered regional aspects within it, but it is still a national level risk assessment. When we're seeing a number of localised risk assessments happening around the country, and that's really important that that's happening. It's really important that they're designed for your specific situation. There might be some risks that you would put higher up your list as more important to address more immediately because of your local situation. So do just really want to emphasize there's a lot of information from this that will be useful for you, but at the same time, please do bring your local knowledge and experience into that as well. Thank you.
Kia ora, Karen. Some good questions coming through. Moving along, we've got a question here from Mauricio Fermento Born. Kia ora, Mauricio. The question is, how is the interest from businesses, private sector, and business associations on this type of assessment? Do you see it growing? So I'm going to pass that question along back to you, Holly, please.
Yeah, kia ora, Mauricio. We've been really pleased actually to see the level of interest coming from the business sector from this report. that, of course, is that one of the domains of risk that we have analysed in the assessment is risks to the economy and finance from climate change. And there are several. And so it's really great to see the interest from the sector in our findings. We've had a lot of requests to come and talk with the Sustainable Business Council, insurance groups in particular, but broader interest too from business groups across the sector and understanding how this assessment can help them prepare for the impacts, and also, I guess, to understand beyond the hazards themselves, those wider implications of climate change for the economy, for insurance, for business. So yeah, answer is yes, we have had a lot of interest, and it's really good to see.
Kia ora, Holly. Kia ora, Mauricio. Thanks for that question. I'm just sitting here through. We've got another question here from Maria Stapleton. So Maria's question is, how do New Zealand's risks compare to other countries in comparison? I'm going to open this up. Who would like to answer that, Holly?
I can start. Karen can add to
Yep.
it if she's got thoughts. Yeah, I think what has been really interesting is looking at, as I said, looking across at other jurisdictions' risk assessments, seeing where the common elements are, and there are many, and where there are differences. So, what I'd say, generally speaking, is that that list of 10 significant risks we've come up with is broadly consistent with the types of risks that we see identified in other countries' risk assessments. There's a lot of overlap with what was found by Australian counterparts last year, for example. But there are some differences that really reflect specific things about Aotearoa New Zealand. And as an example, I think I'd give the risk to water infrastructure and its very strong rating here as an example. We actually had a visiting scientist from Italy with us at the Commission for a few months last year during the time that we were doing some of the risk scoring assessments. And he was really curious about that one at first and kind of asking us questions like, I wouldn't have expected to see water infrastructure risks so highly rated. It hasn't been our experience in Europe. The difference, I think, is the nature of the deferred maintenance on our water infrastructure and the fact that it is in such a degraded state. So while it may not be any more exposed than water infrastructure in other countries, that vulnerability piece, which is to do with its the state in which those climate change hazards are meeting it, really elevates its severity as a climate risk here. So I guess there's certainly commonalities, but there are differences based on the particular characteristics that we have here as well.
Kia ora, Holly. Thanks, Maria. Unfortunately, we're at time, so we have to leave it there, I'm afraid.